Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me today. So today we're going to be talking about real-life zombies and where you can find them in the spirit of Halloween. Um, but before we begin, I want to briefly talk about what I mean when I say zombies, because there's kind of these two competing ideas when you look at the film and pop culture out there. So the traditional view of a zombie is kind of the dead come back to life, the Armageddon, dead walking the earth sort of view. And there's many great examples of movies, video games, and TV shows even of zombies that really captivate, the public audience. However, when we talk about biology, these types of zombies don't make a lot of sense, at least not in the terms of science, right? When something is dead and decomposing, coming back to life and not having muscles and the ligaments required to move your body around, it just doesn't add up. However, there is a subcategory of zombie movies in which a pathogen, it's usually a virus or it can be a bacteria or a fungi in some cases, will infect people and cause them to behave in very erratic, usually aggressive ways. Movies like I Am Legend and 28 Days Later. These are great examples of zombie movies that don't deal with the dead coming back to life so much as just a pathogen that has infected people and change their behavior in some way. And this turns out to be a much more compelling argument for zombies, at least in a biological sense. And there are real world examples of these sorts of mind altering pathogens. But before we talk about how pathogens are able to control their hosts, we need to talk about the types of interactions that occur between organisms. When we call these symbioses. You may be familiar with the term from the Marvel universe, the Spider-Man anti-hero Venom, and some of the villains that have come out, like in the new movie Carnage. There's basically three different ways in which two organisms can interact with one another. The first type is called mutualism. You can think of this as a win-win situation. So mutualism is when two organisms interact and both benefit from that relationship. So pollinators are a great example. Pollinators land on the flowers, they get nectar to eat, and in return, they transport some of that pollen to other flowers to help them reproduce. So in that case, both are benefiting. There's also commensalism. This one's a little less common, but in this situation, you have one organism that gets a benefit and another organism that doesn't really benefit from the relationship, but neither are they really harmed from it. Tree frogs are an excellent example of commensalism. Tree frogs hang out in the tree, they're camouflaged up there, they get protection from predators. However, the tree doesn't really care that the frog's there, and nor does it really gain anything from the frog being there. But my favorite type of symbiosis, and the one that I'll be focusing on today, is called parasitism. Now, parasites are organisms that benefit from a relationship, but at a negative cost to the other organism that they're interacting with, which we will call the host. So if you've ever been walking, in the local parks and you've gotten bitten by a mosquito, or maybe you've gotten a tick on you, that's an example of a parasite. The organism is basically drinking your blood, which is a negative cost to you, and a benefit for them. Now, there's many different types of parasites, and in particular, I study fungal parasites, and there's many examples of fungal symbiosis as well. Mycorrhizal fungi, for example, as shown here, are mutualistic fungi that form partnerships with plants in order to help them grow better, and in exchange, they receive some of the carbon, the sugar that is stored in the roots of the plants. There are commensal fungi, for example, lichens, if you want to consider them to be a fungal organism. They like to hang out on trees, much like the tree frogs did, and the trees don't really mind this relationship. And this is beneficial for the lichens because they get more access to solar energy to do photosynthesis. And as I mentioned, there are plenty of examples of fungal pathogens. Fungal pathogens cause billions of dollars of damage to agricultural plants like corn, wheat, and tomatoes every single year. These can be these little tiny rust that you see on the plant down on the bottom right here, or they can just be simple wilts that eat plant leaves and cause the host to die off. Now, fungal symbioses aren't just between fungi and plants. There's many of examples of fungal symbioses where they interact with animals as well, as shown here. So some of you may be familiar with this type of yeast that causes athlete's foot, right? And this happens when you play a lot of sports and you don't change your socks very much. You can get athlete's foot. And that's because you're creating the two conditions that fungi love the most, and that's moisture and heat. And you're creating that in your shoes. There's also oral thrush. So this usually only occurs in people with a weakened immune system. And this is actually an example of how an organism can be both mutualistic in some sense and then pathogenic in others. So oral thrush happens when the normal yeast that's usually mutualistic and helps you in your body with things like digesting food can get out of hand and kind of overgrow in people with weakened immune systems. And then there are the really pathogenic fungi like chytrids that are very aggressive. They're kind of like athlete's foot, but instead of just staying on the feet of these amphibians, they actually eat the entire skin. And they do this very quickly, and they're very contagious. So chytrids are a really pathogenic example of fungi. Now, regardless of the types of symbioses that you're talking about, fungi all kind of operate in the same way. There's two major structures. So there's the reproductive structure, with which most of you are probably familiar with, and this is called the fruiting body, or the mushroom, as you may be familiar. So when you're eating fungi on pizza, this is what you're eating, is the reproductive structure. But a lot of the biomass for fungi is actually underneath the ground, and it grows out in these big web-like structures called mycelium. And these mycelium are able to secrete certain compounds to interact with their environment, usually to secrete digestive enzymes to break down food and to do what we call external digestion. So just like when we get ready for lunch and our mouths, maybe we smell the food and our mouth starts to salivate and we start making saliva in preparation for internal digestion, fungi do a similar thing, except rather they secrete all of their saliva outside and grow on their food. So if you've ever seen molds growing on breads or cheese in your house, this is exactly what's happening. The mycelium is secreting compounds to break down the bread or cheese, and then it's absorbing the nutrients. Now, I'm going to be talking to you today about zombie fungi. And zombie fungi not only secrete digestive compounds, but they also secrete chemicals that are able to manipulate their host. And in this case, we're going to be talking about the manipulation of carpenter ants. Now, Ophiocordyceps are known as ascomycetes, or sac fungi, and that's because if you are to take a cross section, meaning if you're to cut the mushroom part of this fungus in half, you'll see that you have all of these little sac-like structures inside this mushroom, and these sac-like structures contain the spores, these long wispy filaments. So these spores rain down and can land on ants, and when an ant is infected by one of these spores, the fungus starts to grow inside and secrete chemicals that change its behavior. Some of the more notable changes of behavior are antisocial behavior. So ants normally are very social organisms, meaning that they form groups, they work as a team, they have individual jobs. But once they're infected with Ophiocordyceps, they kind of forget all that and they kind of abandon the nest and wander off on their own. The fungus also induces something called summiting disease, or basically this desire to climb up to higher locations. So ants spend a lot of their time when infected up in trees and on the peripheral ends, meaning the ends, the really small parts of the plants, and they hang out there until finally the fungus creates one more new phenotype or one more new behavior, which is the ant performing what we call the death grip. So the death grip, as you can see really up close here in the bottom right, is when the ant bites down onto the leaves or the stems with its mandibles and can no longer let go. This holds the ant in place up in the trees so that the fruiting body, or the mushroom of the fungus, can emerge from the back of the head and create more spores that can then be released. And since it's high up in the air, those spores float down in the wind and can spread much more further than if they were otherwise just being made on the forest floor. Now, my research is geared around towards figuring out what kind of chemicals are being made that are able to manipulate the behaviors of these ants, and can those chemicals be used in other animals as well? So to study this, we look at ant brains. So here's an example of an ant brain. And one interesting thing that we've found is when Ophiocordyceps is infecting ants, it grows into the muscle tissue and it'll eat the ligaments and it'll eat the fat tissue, but it won't grow into the brain. Instead, it kind of grows around the brain like a cage. And we think it does this so that it can secrete chemicals directly into the nervous system of the ant to cause these behavioral changes. And I'm going to show you an example of 3 different physical changes that we readily see in ants that are infected in the lab. So this first video up here is how ants walk normally. So what you'll notice is as the ant is walking along, it's doing what's called antenation. So it has 2 antennae, and it's putting its antenna out in front of it, and it's kind of feeling back and forth. And what it's doing is it's smelling for chemical trails left by its nest mates and also smelling for food so that it can leave its own chemical trails and recruit more nest mates to come find it and help it carry it back to the nest. Now, when ants become infected with Ophiocordyceps, they stop doing this antenation. And instead, the antennae are locked more like antlers, and they'll run in one direction and bump into something, and they'll run in another direction and bump into something. And they're very wobbly, just like a zombie would be in the zombie movies. So basically, they become very hyperactive and they become very dumb. They stop being interested in the world around them. They stop smelling things, and they're just running in one direction. Now, here's a video of the death grip that I mentioned, and I wanted to show you this video so you can see that the ant is not just biting down onto this piece of air moss because it wants to, but rather you can actually see if you watch the gaster, it's trying to pull itself off of this air moss. So this biting behavior is caused by the fungi, despite what the ant really wants. So it's another great example of a manipulated behavior. And then the final, a very obvious behavioral change that we see has to do with circadian rhythm. So circadian rhythm is basically your wake-sleep cycle. It's what makes you feel sleepy at night and feel awake during the day. Now, the carpenter ants here in Florida are nocturnal, and this is good for them because it's a lot cooler at night. So if they're going to go out and do their work, they're not exposed to the hot sun. But what we see in infected individuals is they kind of lose this circadian rhythm. So over here on the left, you'll see this is a bucket of uninfected ants, and on the right is our infected group. Now, once it's daylight, or once we turn the lights on, you'll see the uninfected ants go back into their home and prepare for sleep, while the infected ants, much like the zombies we see in our TV shows, are continually awake. They're always roaming the earth. Now, we have some ideas of what might be causing some of these behaviors, and I'm going to talk to you today about some mycotoxins, which if you break it down into the Latin words, myco means fungus, right? So mycology is the study of fungi. And a toxin is self-explanatory. It's a chemical that's bad. So a mycotoxin is a chemical that's made by fungi. And when we look at these chemicals, we can study them in the ants by making extracts that have just that one chemical and then giving it to the ant and seeing how that affects its behavior. And we can do this in three ways. We can simulate trophallaxis, which is a fancy way of saying that how the ants normally feed each other. So like a mama bird will feed its hatchlings, ants also kind of like regurgitate into each other's mouths, and we call this trophallaxis. We can do a topical application where we apply the chemical to the underbelly of the ant right here. And finally, probably the most biologically relevant way of doing this is injection. So because the fungus normally grows inside the exoskeleton of the ant, secreting or injecting the chemical compound directly into the ant is the most natural way in which ants would be normally exposed to this chemical compound. So once we've introduced the mycotoxins, we can then put them in an arena and take some video. We can watch how their behavior changes. And in order to figure out what behavior changes are due to the toxins, we compare them to normal behavior. So here is an example of some of the regularly observed behavior that we see in ants. So on the left here, this first one, we have climbing behavior. So you'll see that ants are very good at climbing, even on slick plastic surfaces like this one, who's climbed on the wall and up onto the lid of the Petri dish. There's grooming next to it. So just like your pets at home, ants like to groom themselves. They'll pull on their antenna and they'll curl up and they'll lick their feet to make sure that they're clean. And the third one here is just walking, which is pretty self-explanatory. And finally, ants rest. So sometimes ants get tired and you'll see them sitting there. Now you can tell that they're still awake because you'll see their heads slowly go back and forth and you might see some antenna wave up and down. So we call this resting behavior. Now here's an example of one study I did with a mycotoxin. And on the left here is a water control. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the scientific process, a control is something that lets us know that the behavior that we see is due to the chemical and not due to the way that we manipulated the ant. So basically what this control is we injected them with water instead of mycotoxins. And what this will show us is how do ants behave when you pick them up and when you do the injections and you put them back down. So you can see here, we have some walking behavior. You can see it's walking pretty fast. It's probably a little nervous because we picked it up and put it back down. But other than that, nothing unusual. So this is going to be our baseline that we're going to control our mycotoxin to. So here we go. Here's our microtoxin group. So you can see right off the bat that the ant is a little bit more wobbly, right? Instead of walking forward, it's walking side to side. Let me show you that one more time. So you can see it's staggering left and right. So we would call this stagger behavior. Now, so perhaps this particular mycotoxin that we used is what's causing these very zombie-like movements that I showed you earlier. And you might ask yourself, like, why is this important? Why is it important to, study chemicals that make people walk funny? Well, what is a small amount of chemical can be a big dose to an ant because they're so tiny, but perhaps used in larger animals like ourselves, it can be used for medicine. And mycotoxin, for example, is a GABAergic receptor antagonist. So it binds to this thing called a GABA receptor in your brain. And I don't expect anybody to understand what that means, but this is important because this is the same way that things like Xanax or anti-anxiety medications work. So even though it's a different chemical compound and has a different pathway, it's important to study these because perhaps they can be used to treat different behavioral pathologies or different behavioral diseases or problems in people. So in order to study these compounds, we have to collect ants. We have to isolate the zombie fungi, and we have to collect fresh, healthy colonies to do these tests. So we go out in the field and we do this in the local parks here in Florida, and we look for zombie ants. So this particular zombie ant can be found all over Florida. And we use an app called iNaturalist to keep track of where we've been and where we found zombie ants before. So iNaturalist is kind of like an app that's like Pokemon Go, but it's for real life. It's for actual animals. So the way that iNaturalist works is you download the app, you open the app, and it'll give you 3 options in the middle down here. You can select this camera option, and it'll give you the choice to either use your camera in real time or to take pictures and then upload them later. So once you upload your picture, you can see I've taken a picture of a nice yellow flower here. You can then select this "What did you see" button, and the app, just like Pokemon Go, will suggest what it thinks that this real flower is. And in this case, the app suggests that this is a tick seed. Now this is where you come in. It's up to you to be the curator of your own museum of finds. So it'll give you a recommendation based on computer learning algorithms, but it will also give you other options of things other people have seen nearby that look similar to what you've taken a picture of. So sometimes, the computer doesn't get the organism right, and it's up to you to select what the correct organism is. Once you've selected this, it then uploads it to a database with your GPS coordinates of where the picture was taken, and real-life scientists can use this to go and find, different species and find out where they live in the world. Now, let's say you're taking a picture of something in your backyard and you don't really want scientists rummaging around your backyard for rare insects or whatever you've taken a picture of. The app also gives you an option to disable this geo coordinate or the GPS on your pictures as well. So if all you want to do is kind of share with your friends all the cool things that you found, you can turn that feature off. So here's a map of all the Ophiocordyceps that have been found across the world. And you can see here in Florida, there's plenty of examples of places where people have found zombie ants. So iNaturalist not only acts as a really cool app for you to log your own finds, but you can use it as a map to go where other people have found zombie ants and to take a look at those groups as well. Now, if you do decide to go looking for zombie ants, you might also find some other interesting things as well. And this is one new species of fungus that our group has discovered, and it's called a hyperparasite. And we named this one Niveomyces because niveo means ice, and these look like little icicles coming off of the ant. Now, it's called a hyperparasite because the Niveomyces here is not actually infecting the ant, it's actually infecting the Ophiocordyceps. So it's a parasite of the parasite. Much like in Inception, you have a dream in a dream, this is a parasite within a parasite. And there's plenty other examples of zombie parasites out there too that you might find. There's zombie snails that are infected with worms that also cause summiting disease, where the snail will climb on top of plants. And then you can see in the eye stalk here, this green and red color is actually the worm itself, and it'll dance back and forth and kind of highlight the snail so that birds can swoop down and eat the snail, and then the worm reproduces in the bird's digestive tract. There are many other examples of insects that are infected by fungus that change behaviors as well, and even aquatic organisms. So thank you so much for having me to talk to you. I do want to talk a little bit about some of our outreach opportunities. So if you want to learn more about our group, the Zombie Fungus Foray, you can check out our Twitter profile, which has a lot of the science aspect of our project. So it talks about newly discovered Ophiocordyceps species and types of science research that have found cool mycotoxins or other compounds that can be used to do things like cure cancer, for example. We also have a website, thezombiefungusforay.com. So this website's great if you want to learn more about how to find zombie ants or how to send in samples. There's also a tab on there called Ophiocordyceps species that has about 60 different species of zombie ants that you can go and take a look at in high definition. And then finally, the last thing I want to share with you today is our TikTok outreach. So we started a TikTok several months ago about how to keep ants and how to make an ant farm. So we collected one of these Camponotus floridanus ants here in Florida, and we caught one of the newly mated queens, and we've been keeping track and posting weekly videos ever since. So I'll give you one preview of this video real quick.
A lot of mats to feed. Time for some protein. Let's see how they like a couple of fruit flies. I'll speed things up a bit. Lol, looks like they are a bit scared of their food. Look at them protecting the brood by moving them back in the tube. Perhaps by tomorrow they will chow down and we can move them to their new home. Join our colony and follow for more.
So if you want to learn more about zombie ants and you want to learn more about how to start ant farms, check out any of these available resources. And again, thank you so much for inviting me. And if there's any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining. We do have a couple of questions that have already come in. The first one they want to know is, how common is it to find zombie ants in your own backyard?
That's a great question. So I will say that when we go out and we look for them, we usually have a better chance of finding them when we go to like the parks. So they seem to not do so well in the urban environments. And one of these reasons may be due to temperature. So it's usually a lot warmer when you have asphalt and things like that all over. And these zombie fungus are very particular. They like a very certain type of heat and they like a very certain amount of moisture. So finding them in your backyard really depends on where you live. If you live in a city, it'd probably be harder to find them in your backyard. But if you kind of live out in a more rural area, you very well may find these in your own backyards. And I'd highly recommend, if you're interested, going to some of the local parks. Now, when you're looking for them, they usually pop up in clusters. So if you can find one, you'll find tons of them. But if you are finding that you're looking through a lot of trees and you're not really finding any, then it's probably just that they're not in that area.
Is it safe to catch them?
Yes. So one thing I didn't talk about today is the host specificity, which means the types of things that this fungus can infect. And this fungus is categorized as a very host-specific fungus because it only infects this one carpenter ant. So just the carpenter ants that you find in Florida. So if you were to even take this fungus and try to infect other types of carpenter ants, like the ones that live in Pennsylvania, for example, they wouldn't be successful at manipulating that host. So not only are people completely safe from these types of fungus, but other insects even can't be infected.
They want to know if humans have to worry about certain types of funguses and becoming zombies.
So the short answer is no. You don't have to worry about this type of fungus infecting you. There are other types of fungus that especially if you're immunocompromised or if you get a specific type of fungal infection, can make you sick. But there aren't any examples of zombie fungi for people. Although if you're interested, there is a very fun movie about what if these fungi could infect people, and it's called The Girl with All the Gifts. And it's an excellent zombie movie. One of our collaborators actually worked as a scientist on the film to kind of help them with the biology of it all. So it's a very cool film to watch.
Awesome. That's all of our questions. At this time, is there anything else you would like to tell students who might be interested in studying ants in the future?
Yeah, if you're interested in this type of research, maybe you're a high school student looking where to go to college. If you go to our Zombie Fungus 4A page, there's an About Us tab on there, and you can click on that and learn more about the University of Central Florida, which is where we do our research. And it'll give you some links to some programs that help students get involved in science when they join college, if that is indeed where you decide to go.
Awesome. I want to thank you so much for your time and your expertise. It's always such an interesting topic to hear about and to learn more about. So I enjoyed it, and I'm sure the classes did. We already have some thank yous coming in. So thank you so much for your time. And thank you to the students who asked wonderful questions. They were awesome. And definitely go check out that TikTok. I'm curious.
Thank you again for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to talk with you guys.
Absolutely. And have a great weekend, everyone, and a good happy Halloween.